Thank you, Tina. I'm so happy to be speaking to this audience. Creative Mornings is a really special group of people. And thank you to Robert for hosting. So I'm just going to jump in and tell you a little bit about my project, the work that I'm doing, and some of the background as we go along, and then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. Excuse me. So this strange-looking plant is called the Ureta. What looks like moss covering rocks is actually a shrub comprised of thousands of branches, each with clusters of tiny green leaves at the end. And it's so densely packed together that you could actually stand on top of it. And this particular individual lives in the Atacama Desert in Chile at about 15,000 feet elevation, and it's around 3,000 years old. It also happens to be a relative of parsley. So for the past 5 years, I've been researching, working with biologists, and traveling all over the world to photograph continuously living organisms that are 2,000 years old and older. So the project is part art and part science. There's an underlying environmental component. And I'm also trying to create a means in which to step outside of our quotidian experience of time and really start to consider deep time. So I chose 2,000 years as my minimum age because I wanted to start at what we consider to be year zero and to work backwards from there. So this tree that you're looking at is called Jomansugi, and this was the catalyst for the project. So I had been traveling in Japan with no other agenda than to make photographs. And as you may know, I come from a fine arts background and make a lot of landscape work dealing with the relationship between humanity and nature. And when I got to Japan, people kept telling me about this remarkable tree. So I decided to go and visit it. And the travel experience was amazing. It was on this remote island. It was a 2-day hike to visit this tree. But it was actually many months later when I was back home in New York that I actually got the idea for the Oldest Living Things as a project. So I really think it was my long-standing desire to bring together my interests in art, science, and philosophy that allowed me to be ready when the proverbial light bulb came on. So I started researching, and to my surprise, this project had never been done before in the arts or the sciences. And in fact, there isn't actually an area of the sciences that deals with this idea of global species longevity, if you will. In fact, I thought that I would find one biologist who would be my collaborator on the project. And what I found was that everyone claimed that they didn't have the expertise to cover such a broad range of subjects. So actually I found that really exciting. So what you're looking at here is something called the Rhizocarpon geographicum, or map lichen. And this is around 3,000 years old and lives in Greenland, which is a long way to go for some lichens. Traveling to Greenland was really more like traveling back in time than just traveling very far north. It's more primal and more remote than anything I had ever experienced before. And especially when you consider that these lichens grow only 1 centimeter every 100 years, it really puts human lifespans into a different perspective. Now, this is an aerial shot taken in eastern Oregon here in the US. And if the title, Searching for Armillaria Death Rings, sounds ominous, it is. The armillaria is actually a predatory fungus. It's also more commonly known as the honey mushroom or the humongous fungus because it actually is one of the world's largest organisms. So I traveled to Oregon and met with the biologists who work in maintaining the national park there. And they gave me some GPS coordinates and some maps, and I chartered a plane, and I went out searching for what they call death rings. So the fungus kills these trees in this circular pattern. So I'm not actually sure if I captured any of the death rings in this image, but the fungus is definitely underground here. And shortly thereafter, I lost my breakfast and had to return to the hangar. Okay, sorry. So this is back down on the ground. This is actually the fungus invading this tree. So that white material that you see in between the bark and the wood of the tree is known as the mycelial felt of the fungus. And what it's doing is slowly strangling the tree to death by preventing the flow of water and nutrients. And this strategy has served it pretty well. This fungus is 2,400 years old. And from underground to underwater, this is a 2,000-year-old brain coral, which is the most recent thing that I photographed. This is in Tobago. And I actually got my open water scuba certification while making these photographs. So this is at about 60 feet depth, and it's around 18 feet across, so it's pretty big. And I thought it looked sort of like a moon or a meteor from a science fiction movie. So you can see there's a little damage to the surface of the coral there, and that was caused by a school of parrotfish that were actually eating the coral. Though luckily they lost interest and moved on to something else before causing it serious damage. And more lucky still, it seems to be out of harm's way of the recent oil spill in the Gulf, but the full impact of that disaster is still yet to be seen. Now this is one of my favorites. This is a clonal colony of quaking aspen trees, known as pando, which means I spread in Latin. It is 80,000 years old. So what looks like a forest is technically only one tree. So each tree that you see there is a stem coming up from one self-contained root system. So it's one giant genetically identical whole. It also happens to be male and, in theory, immortal. So this is another clonal tree. This is the Spruce grand Pisea, which I photographed this time last year in Sweden. And the biologist who discovered this tree, which was only discovered a couple of years ago, was reluctant to share the exact location of the tree with me, just because they're trying to protect it, and understandably so. But that spindly growth that you see there in the center is most likely a product of climate change. So he explained to me that over the past 40 years or so, as the temperature has gone up, the vegetation zone is actually changing on the top of the mountain. So we don't even necessarily need to have direct contact with these organisms in order to have a very real effect on them. This is the Fortingall yew. No, I'm just kidding. This is the Fortingall yew. So I put that slide in because I'm often asked if there are any animals in my project. And aside from the coral, the answer is no. So does anybody have any idea how old the oldest tortoise is? Any guesses? 125? Well, okay, it's 176, which is up there, but nowhere near 2,000. And some of you might have also heard a few years back they discovered a clam off the northern coast of Iceland that lived to the ripe old age of 405, but it actually died in the lab as they were determining how old it was. Yeah. And then I think the most exciting discovery of late has been the so-called immortal jellyfish, which has been shown in the lab to be able to revert back to the polyp state after reaching full maturity. So that being said, it's highly unlikely that any jellyfish would survive that long in the wild. So back to the yew. So the yew is living in a churchyard in Scotland. You can see it's behind a protective wall. And it's many thousands of years old. It's between 2,000 and 5,000 years old, so it still has that wide age range as an estimate. And there are actually many ancient yews in churchyards across the UK. But if you do the math, you remember it's actually the yews that were there first, then the churches. And then down to another part of the world, I had the opportunity to travel around the Limpopo province in South Africa with an expert in baobab trees. And we saw several of these ancient trees, and this one is probably the oldest. This is the Sagoli baobab, and it's around 2,000 years old. And really, I think of all of the oldest living things as palimpsests. They contain all of their histories within themselves, as well as records of natural and human events. And the baobabs in particular are a great example of this. The Sagoli in particular, it's a little hard to see on the slide, but there's actually names carved in, graffitied into the trunk of the tree. And it also records natural events. So over time, the baobabs tend to get pulpy in their centers and hollow out, which makes a great natural shelter for animals. But they've also been appropriated for some rather dubious human uses, including a prison, a toilet, and even a bar inside these trees. And this is another one of my favorite. This is called the Welwitschia mirabilis. This lives only in parts of coastal Namibia and Angola, where it's uniquely adapted to get its moisture completely from mist coming off the sea. And this is just an incredibly strange and improbable plant. It's actually a tree, and what's more, it's a conifer. So I'm not sure if you can see there's actually cones. It's bearing cones down the center there. And what's more, what looks like two big piles of leaves are actually only two single leaves that continue to grow and pile on top of themselves, and they get shredded up by the elements over time. So it actually is the longest leaves in the plant kingdom. So these have been growing for 2,000 years. So I spoke to a biologist at the Kirstenbosch Botanical Garden in Cape Town to ask his theory on how these came about. And he mentioned that if you travel around Namibia, you see there's a number of petrified forests, and they're all giant conifers. And so his theory is that thousands of years ago, flooding swept these trees down from northern Africa, and that what resulted was this remarkable adaptation to these new conditions. And this brings us to what I think is the most poetic of the oldest living things. This is something called an underground forest. And this was photographed near Pretoria, South Africa, which is a bushveld region. So it's very dry and prone to a lot of fires. So I spoke to a botanist at the Pretoria Botanical Garden who explained to me that certain species of trees have adapted in this really remarkable way. So if you imagine that if this is the crown of the tree and this is ground level, imagine that it just migrated completely underground. So that whole bulk of the tree, the roots, the trunk, the branches are all underground, and what you see on top is just the crown. So that way, when a fire comes roaring through, it's the equivalent of getting your eyebrows singed. The tree can easily recover. And these also grow clonally, the oldest of which are known to get up to 13,000 years old. And that's actually not as unusual as you might think. Back in the US, this is a clonal creosote bush found in the Mojave Desert that's around 12,000 years old. And if you've ever been in the Southwest, you know the creosote is a rather ubiquitous plant. But what's happening here is this plant is slowly expanding outwards from that original center. And again, that's one interconnected, genetically identical from one side to the other individual that's been growing for 12,000 years. And it also has a friend down the road, or I think they're friends. This is the Clonal Mojave Yucca. And this is probably a little bit older than 12,000. And you can see that there's some younger clones behind, right behind it. And so both the creosote and the yucca live on Bureau of Land Management land, which is very different from being protected in a national park. In fact, this area is actually designated for recreational all-terrain vehicle use. And then the last thing that I wanted to share that's between 400,000 and 600,000 years old. And this was just discovered a few years ago by a team of planetary biologists who were trying to find clues to life on other planets by visiting one of the harshest climates on ours. So what they did was they bore into the permafrost and ended up finding this bacteria. And I'm sure you've all heard of many different types of bacteria that have been dormant for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. But there's something different about this bacteria. They found that it's actually doing DNA repair below freezing, which means that it has been living and growing for 500,000 years. It also happens to be probably one of the most vulnerable of the oldest living things, because if the permafrost is not permanent, this bacteria is not going to survive. And then I just wanted to share a map of all the locations of all of these organisms. The blue flags represent things that I've already photographed, and the reds are places that I'm still trying to get to. And you'll notice there are flags on every continent, including Antarctica, where I was surprised to find there's 5,000-year-old moss banks living on the Antarctic Peninsula. Which is pretty exciting. And then you'll see there's a swoop of 3 flags there in the Mediterranean. I'm actually leaving on Sunday to go photograph 3 new additions to the project. 2 of them are trees. It's a chestnut tree in Sicily and an olive tree in Crete, both of which are around 3,000 years old. And then the one I'm most excited about is a 100,000-year-old clonal seagrass that lives in Spain. So I'll be meeting with a team of biologists who are doing their field research. And the seagrass actually lives in between the islands of Formentera and Ibiza, of all places. So you never know where you're going to find these things. So obviously the project isn't finished. I think I have around 2 more years left for this phase. Although honestly, I think it's something that I'll keep doing for the rest of my life. But that being said, I feel like at this point I really know what the project is about. So as I said at the beginning, the project is part art, it's part science, there's an environmental component, and it's also a means in which to consider deep time. So the oldest living things in the world are a record and celebration of our past, they're a call to action in the present, and they're a barometer of our future. So these amazing organisms have survived in deserts, in the permafrost, at the tops of mountains, in the bottom of the ocean for millennia. And, but now some of them are in danger, and they can't just get up and get out of the way. So I'm hoping that by doing this work and sharing it with you, that I can help ensure their continued longevity into the foreseeable future. Thank you. Sorry? Okay. Okay, does anybody have a question? Yes. Okay, so the question was about how I've come to know about these things. And, it's really a lot of research. So early on, I really did a lot of Google searching. But as soon as I knew what I was looking for, you'd be surprised there are a lot of scientific papers online. So what I would do is actually find out who was researching these things, or better yet, who discovered these things, and just call them up or send them an email and explain what I was doing. And 9 times out of 10, the biologists are so happy that somebody outside of their area of expertise is actually interested in this work that they're doing, that they've been really warm and open, and a lot of times I do end up meeting them in the field, which is the best case scenario. And at this point, sometimes people just, strangers say, I heard about your work, have you heard about such and such, which is great. And that the bacteria, the oldest living thing in the world, I found out about at a New Year's Eve party in Brooklyn, where the biologist who was on the team happened to be there. So you never know where it's going to come from. Oh. Yes? I'm sorry. The question... Okay, well, I might turn that question back to you. So the first part of the question was, what are some of the methods of dating? And I should say that, I try to be as accurate as possible in the information that I share as part of the work. So a lot of times it's dependent upon the type of organism, how the dating is done. So, in terms of trees, they now can bore holes in them and do dendrochronology, which is counting tree rings. There's a lot of radiocarbon dating being done. And then there's also a lot of studies done on growth rates. So you might measure over the course of 5, 10, 20 years the growth rate, especially in clonal organisms, and then extrapolate the data and figure out an age from there. So that being said, a couple of these things, you saw that there was a range of dates. Like, why does it say 2,000 to 5,000 years? Well, in some cases, it's actually just not a scientific priority. And I would say that, in that map that I showed you, if you saw a lot of things in the US, in part, there's more data and there's more research money. So I don't think that there's only those 3 things in Africa, but that research just, in a lot of cases, I think, hasn't been done yet. So the second part of the question was, what do you think that the oldest living things can teach us? And I do actually hope that I do turn that question out to all of you. Although there are a couple of things that I've learned through the process of putting all of putting this group together. And one is that these things tend to live in fringe environments. They live in places where other things would fail to survive, let alone thrive. So I think there's an interesting lesson in there. And also I would say that, a lot of them grow incredibly slowly. So it's slow and steady as opposed to big and flashy. So I think there's something to be taken from that as well. The question was, do I have a book? And the answer is not yet, but I'm working on it. Yes? Sorry, can you repeat that? The technical aspects? Well, I mostly shoot with a medium format film camera, so I still shoot film. In the cases of the bacteria or the underwater shots, I'm using different techniques, like obviously the microscope was the digital optical microscopy for the bacteria, and then I use digital for that underwater shot, and I'm actually using 2 different cameras when I go shoot the seagrass in Spain. I'll be using a 35 millimeter underwater film camera, and then also a different digital, which will hopefully yield better results. And then aesthetically, I really think of these as plant portraits. So I'm not thinking of them in the same terms as I would, or how I approach my landscape work. So if you go online and see some of my landscape work, the landscape images are composed differently, they have different weight to them. These images, I'm hoping to get some of just the form and the personality and the content of these organisms, almost in an anthropomorphic way. Yes.
So do you run into questions of how people define what's living or not? Like, as you get into long ranges, biologists have different views.
Right. So the question was, do I run into issues with how I determine what's living or continuously living? And I created the framework for this project. I chose 2,000 years. I chose the idea of continuously living, which I include clonal organisms to be continuously living. You could make arguments in all sorts of different ways. Because I've defined this in this set of parameters, it seems to be pretty comfortable. And when I talk to biologists, they tend to agree. Like, the idea of a clonal organism still is a continuously living organism. Just the same way that you and I don't have any of the cells that we were born with, we're still us. So you could say the same thing would be true for this 80,000-year-old clonal tree. It's still the same organism. It did not reproduce sexually. It's continued to live and has that same genetic material. So, yes? Yeah.
Was that a common perception in other areas of the world, or are these organisms living in obscurity?
So that's an interesting question. So the question was, in Japan, there was a lot of affection and knowledge about Jomansugi, the ancient tree, and the question was, is that true for all of these other organisms? And I say it really varies. In some cases, like the clonal Mojave Yucca and Creosote Bush, there's no affection for them. I mean, literally, people are out there on their four-wheelers racing around them, whereas other places, there's actually quite a bit of pride that, it becomes a tourist attraction. So even like the bristlecone pine, which I don't think I shared with you today, but, that's a pretty well-known tree. It's the oldest non-clonal tree on the planet. And something like that is, it's somewhat known, and people have a certain amount of, or the giant sequoias as well, we have a certain amount of pride for those things. But also the bristlecone is protected in that the identity of the exact oldest tree is hidden so that people don't take souvenirs off of it, which was actually happening. So it's a really interesting relationship. In some cases, there's one organism that lives on somebody's private property that has no protection. And then in other cases, there was one of the baobab trees, one that had a bar inside of it, is a huge tourist attraction. So it really ranges. And ideally, I'm actually hoping through the course of doing this work that I can help try to get some protection. I would love, it would be a dream come true to get UNESCO designation for each of these organisms. Yes?
Is there a particular plant that's eluded you that you just haven't been able to find that you've heard about or searching for?
A particular plant that's eluded me? Is that the question? Oh, okay. I think the most difficult is this moss on Antarctica. So I've found some scientific papers about the moss confirming that it's 5,000 years old, but you can't just walk around Antarctica and hope you find some moss. So it's been tricky because I haven't found any active research on it right now. So that's been the most difficult, both in figuring out how to get there, as well as making sure that I'm getting to the right place. Yes? Sure, okay. So the question is, do I apply, have I applied for grants? How am I getting funding to do this work? And I have to say, it has been incredibly difficult. The one really big success I've had was running a campaign on Kickstarter, and thank you to a number of people in the audience today who have actually supported my Kickstarter campaign, so thank you. You are funding my next trip that I leave on in 2 days. But that being said, I've sunk tens of thousands of my own money into this project, and it's just because it's something that I believe in. I've applied to grants. The most money I've gotten for a grant is $500. So not a huge help. I'm hoping that will change. But it's tricky. I mean, I don't have a good, I don't have an easy solution for you. But again, to sing the praises of Kickstarter, the great thing about that is that, some people donated $1, some people pledged 1,000, so it leaves that room open for whatever people are comfortable with while building a community around your work and sharing your work with people that are now invested in the success of your project. So I'd say by and large that is the one most positive experience that I've had fundraising. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.